You've been asked to write a literature review, but what is a literature review and how do you write one? So first, when we're talking about a literature review, it's really an ongoing conversation among scholars about a particular topic. It synthesizes the key themes around that topic and it evaluates and explains those sources. In particular, when it's setting up for a final project, an original research project or a capstone project, it identifies gaps in the literature, so what we don't yet know. Now, the purpose of a literature review really is to demonstrate both depth and breadth. So it's not just listing everything that you've read, although that's part of it. It's also to integrate and evaluate each of those sources and put them in a particular context. Students often have trouble with summarizing, sort of serial summarizing projects where they just say what one author said, another author said, another author said. A literature review really is about synthesizing those sources so that you can tell a coherent story. But how do you write a literature review? First, start with the themes. You'll need an introduction, but do that last. You'll start identifying the themes that emerge from the literature that you review. So, as you are evaluating the sources, each one you read, determine what the main question or problem of that paper is, what theory, methods, or models they use, identify the key concepts from that paper, and what conclusions they came to, particularly their findings. Also, make sure that you identify the limitations of that study. So no study is perfect. What are the limitations of that paper? Finally, in a literature review that is designed to lead to a larger project, you should make sure that you know and identify how that source relates to your project and relates to each other source. So it's a comparison of various sources. So do these sources confirm each other's findings? Do they contradict or they complicate each other's findings? I identified all of these points for each source. Then you want to identify the themes. So looking over all of the papers that you've read, what patterns emerge from this body of literature as a whole? So do they share, for example, common theories or methods? Do they have results in common? Do they have common questions, or do they use common concepts? And then identify those contradictions or debates within that literature as a whole. Can you identify particular sources that seem to be key? And one way to do this is to see which sources are cited most frequently. You can do this by plugging the source into Google Scholar. It shows you how many times it's been cited. Sometimes that's an indication of a key source, or you've noticed that within that literature, many of the papers cite that source. Then that's probably a key source. Once you've identified those themes, hang things together by the theme. So when you start writing, you want to have headers that describe the theme. You'll have sort of a descriptive theme, and then you'll group all of the papers together under that theme. So now it's time to write. As you're writing, you want to start with a topic sentence for each paragraph or section. So define one sentence that encapsulates the theme of that section or that paragraph, and then expand from there. Start with the general pattern or the general theme first, so a broad sort of description of that theme, and then discuss specific findings. When you're in that section, you'll want to compare the different sources that touch on that theme. Remember, again, you're focusing on integrating and evaluating and synthesizing those sources, not simply summarizing those sources. So once you have the body written, then go back and write the introduction and the conclusion. So when you write the intro, the first thing that you want to do, you want to make sure the introductory paragraph gives us the big picture. This is the so what question. Why should we care? Why is this topic important? Why do we need to know this background information to prepare us for the rest of your paper? Make sure in that intro you state whatever your topic is, your problem or the question that you are emphasizing. And then in that introductory paragraph, briefly highlight the main claims that you're going to make. One way to do this is to restate the topic sentences for each section. That can give you an overall large framework. Then you'll also need your conclusion. Likewise, in the conclusion, you're going to need to restate your topic or your problem or your question and briefly restate the major findings that came out in the literature review. Also, make sure that you highlight those conflicts or gaps or unresolved issues, particularly if those are ones that you're going to address in the rest of your paper, in the research project that you're setting up or the final project that you're doing. If you are going to highlight, address one of those conflicts or gaps, you'll want to make sure that you mention that in the conclusion of your literature review before you go into the next section. And restate the big picture again. A few things to remember and when you're writing. Make sure that as you read those papers and as you write about them, that you are staying focused on your purpose. And the purpose, again, of the literature review is to give us the background, to let us know what scholars are talking about in this particular area. So as you're reading and as you're writing, remember, that's your overall focus. Make sure that you do identify the broad problem area, but avoid broad global statements. So don't make big blanket statements that aren't substantiated. You're going to need to make sure that you can substantiate any claims that you make in the literature review. Be wary of using direct quotes. So students often use a lot of quotes in part because they're not sure of their own voice in the literature review writing process, but also because they're not exactly sure how to say things. So if you're using direct quotes, make sure that it's essential. Like the way that an author has phrased it is particularly perfect, that they are articulating something that you can't articulate on your own. Just be careful though, because students often use lots and lots of direct quotes and it's not necessary. You want this to be your paper, to be your voice, and other scholars are supporting the ideas that you are developing based on their previous research. So mostly you're going to be paraphrasing, basically taking the basic ideas from other papers and writing them in your own words in a way that makes sense. But be cautious. When people paraphrase, it's easy to get the main point wrong so that you misrepresent what other authors are saying. So just be cautious. Make sure that you are actually representing the author's information correctly. Throughout, you should actually keep your own voice. This is your project. This is your work. You are using other people's work to support your own work. So one way to make sure that this happens is that you start and end each paragraph with something that relates to your thesis, your problem, your question. When students do write, they often use spell check, which is important. Use spell check, but it's not sufficient. You need to proofread your paper. Read it over for continuity. Read it over to make sure that it makes sense. Read it over to make sure that spell check didn't make some goofy error and allow you to use a word that doesn't make sense in that context. Finally, you should make multiple revisions of your literature review. So write it all out. Get to the ugly first draft stage, just dump everything in and then revise it to something that makes more sense. And revise it again and revise it again so that it makes more sense. Each time you revise it, you'll get a little more clear in your understanding. You'll get a little more clear in how you're conveying your ideas. You'll just get to be a better paper. So revise, revise, revise. That's it. Now, go forth and write your literature review. Good luck.